Welcome to the Rich in Purpose Transform Childhood Summit. Today we're here with Dr. Laura Anderson, and we're going to talk about religious trauma, something you don't normally talk about, I think, in summits. But we're all anxious to hear what you have to say, Dr. Laura. So tell us a little bit about how you became passionate about this particular subject.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here. Obviously, this is something I really enjoy talking about. Like most therapists, I specialize in things that that hit me personally, that I have gone through and know many people who have navigated as well. So my own personal background is in high control religion. I grew up in it. Whenever, kind of that, whenever the church doors were open, I was there. I was in a ministry family. My dad was the director at a fundamentalist Christian camp. We lived on site. And so it was all around me. I was in the bubble, the religious bubble. I graduated from high school. I started working at a church. I attended there. I spent every waking hour there. All of my relationships were there. My paycheck was tied to there. Everything was all about my religious life. I was deeply, deeply committed. And eventually, some things happened that I now would call spiritual abuse. And it got me to a point of considering, is this really what I want to be involved in? I was feeling terribly about myself and kind of took some steps back. I got a different job. I didn't volunteer quite as much. And that space gave me some time to really start reflecting and considering other career paths, which eventually led me back to get my master's degree in marriage and family therapy and start a career as a therapist. And at the same time, I moved to the South, which is, in the South, it's, what's your name and what church do you go to? That's the first questions, right? And so I was like right in the middle of, just religion is a part of the culture, it is baked into it. And I was going through my own process of questioning and healing and recognizing how high control religion had impacted me. And all of a sudden, clients started trickling into my office with very similar stories. And I started to recognize, wow, like the things that happened to me that I thought maybe were just isolated to myself have also happened to many, many other people. And so to make a very long story short, I started to specialize. I specialized in trauma. I started to recognize dynamics of power and control inside of high control religions, how that operated, how that impacted people. And that was right around the time that social media was becoming a way that we communicated and got information. And so I started a platform and just educating people on trauma. And eventually it landed me into a position where I was able to start my own company, and other coaches work for me and work with people who are coming out of high control religions, cults and fundamentalism, purity culture, all of that really, really fun stuff that we'll probably be getting into a little bit today. And we don't have the goal of, making atheists or getting people to leave church, but it really is navigating the harm that they have endured as a result of religious institutions or religious relationships, maybe pastors or other leaders, and getting them to a place where they can decide for themselves what is healthy spirituality, what does faith look like for them or not look like for them, and live a life that is congruent with their values, based off of what is important to them versus what they're being told by other institutions. So there's so much more we could go into, but for sake of time, I'll leave it there for today.
Well, that's good because, well, I went to a mega church here in Florida,
Mhm.
and I went there for 13 years and was very involved in the church. And all of a sudden, I started realizing that as long as you went within their system, they
Yes.
liked you.
Mhm.
But if you didn't go through their system, then you were doing something wrong. Not that you were doing something wrong by the Bible, but
Right.
that you were doing something wrong within their system. And that's one thing I want to ask you first, Dr. Laura, is that so many of us, especially that we've endured childhood trauma, we
Mhm.
have a we have a trouble being loved anyway. And then we go to a church where we're taught that God is love, and there's no fear in perfect love.
Yeah.
But then you go with something outside of their system, and now all of a sudden they will reprimand you,
Yeah.
and you're trying to think, well, I thought I was doing something like your purpose, and but now they're not letting me do it. How do we deal with our own self-love when the
Mhm.
church, who is really supposed to be love, is ran by humans that aren't love, and they they put you through something that you start feeling like I'm not even loved.
Yeah, I just want to validate that because I think that is actually quite common. I think there is, an understanding that you should be able to go to a church or a religious institution and experience love and acceptance and belonging. And that's what they promise, right? We welcome all who come in. And I certainly don't want to lump all churches into this dynamic when typically I'm talking about what I call high control religious groups. So groups that are interested in doing what you're saying, where there's conformity, right? And that's the way that you experience acceptance and love is by conforming to the rules that are set out. And so I think when somebody enters that environment, there can be a little bit of that love bombing stage, and that's what gets people into it. They have the promises of acceptance and love and connection, and maybe even physical needs being met. But they soon learn that in order to continue to experience that, I have to conform. I have to let go of my values or my personality or the authentic pieces of myself if I want to be accepted. And that can be a huge betrayal, especially if you're coming out of experiences in childhood where abuse or neglect or trauma has occurred. To experience that again from not only an institution, but one that's connected to a higher power can feel like a re-traumatization or just a huge betrayal, and that can be very, very difficult. And so you said something in your question, how do we realize this is humans that are doing this and not God? I think that is part of it, is recognizing. I don't want to minimize things by saying humans are imperfect, but typically humans, in institutions are interested in their longevity, and that we prioritize the institution over the person. And so in most cases, it has nothing to do with the actual person. It is all about keeping the institution intact and what they stand for. And I think sometimes understanding that can be helpful because it can take away the personal piece of it, of that it's feeling like it's happening to me. It is happening to you, but it's not something you have done. It's because the institution is interested in its own well-being over the individual. And I think, one of the things that I really like about working in this space is that there are many people that have experienced situations like this and they don't know where to go. They don't know if they're the only ones who have gone through it. And so I think being able to find support where people are validating, like, no, it is that bad. That should not have happened. You are important. It wasn't okay for you to be treated like that is very important. As we know with childhood trauma, those same things are very important in that healing process. I think the same thing is true when we look at religious trauma. I put both of them under the umbrella of complex trauma, right? Because usually we're in these situations for long periods of time where our entire identities are wrapped up in them. And so some of the same ways that we might heal from childhood trauma would be very applicable to religious trauma as well.
Well, I want to ask because like I told you, I went through a little bit of a trauma in church recently. So I want to ask you this specific incident for me, and just to kind of get your response for that, because when it happened, I was in a little bit of a disbelief because I was very active in the church for 13 years. But I had this vision that I was going to create this Rich in Purpose, which is a community that helps people with childhood trauma. And I told the church about it, and they really just didn't accept it. And they didn't want me really talking about it too much in church. They didn't want me to like, if you find an investor here at church, Jamie, you can't talk about it because it's not part of our system. And
Mhm.
so that's what I want to just let you or get a little bit of an answer how I should have responded, because I went to another church and then I totally kind of left the church now. But how does that just affect our lives? And how, if it wasn't me, how could it be somebody else? That where would they go to get help?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I really validate that. I mean, where we're at in our country, I don't want to make this a political thing, but there's a crossover between religion and politics. And there was a therapist a few weeks ago who did an experiment. It was when the SNAP benefits had been revoked, and she did an experiment and she called about 50 different churches pretending to be a mother in need of baby formula. just to see who would help her and who was not going to help her. And she experienced open arms in several churches that might be considered non-Christian or, kind of not mainstream religions. And she experienced, hey, what can we do for you? And then in all of these churches that claim to be more of a mainstream religion or kind of in line with bigger denominations, she received no's time and time and time and time again. And it was a very fascinating experience because I think it showed exactly what you're talking. Like we should be able to go to some of these institutions that don't have to, they're not taxed on their donations. They are set up to be able to support their community, or the goal is that they could be a source of support for their community. And if we can't go to them, then where do we go? And I wish I had a simple answer to say, oh, just go to this organization. It's taking its place. But unfortunately, I don't have that answer. But I think that it is important to be able to recognize the pain and even the grief that can come along with that, right? Especially when we've been taught this is supposed to be a place of safety and connection where we can be in community with one another and helping other people. It can be a large source of grief when we realize, oh, that's actually not accessible there. Again, this is not every church. There are many churches that would open their doors and they would give to their community without thinking twice. But I think more and more we are starting to see churches that are functioning more as a business than an actual service organization, people that are interested in taking care of the sick and the poor and the needy and the downtrodden, which in most scriptural texts or holy texts, we see language about that. This is what we're supposed to be doing. But because of a variety of different factors, we're now seeing it kind of operate more as a business. And so I think there's grief in that. I think that there can be sadness and I don't think we have to stop looking to churches for support, but I do think it would behoove us as communities to find some other ways that we can develop community resources as we're seeking to support those in need. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I just want to validate that I do think that's an unfortunate and common issue. And I think it's not because of the person. I think it's because of the direction that many religious institutions are going in terms of functioning like a business and more interested in their own well-being over, again, the well-being of the individual.
Yeah. Well, I know, I had a couple of friends and I said, your church is just a business. And I would fight for the church because I was like, no, they're not a business, right? We're not that way. But when that happens, especially, and again, we're kind of concentrating on people with childhood trauma.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, you get rebuked by an official in the church
Yeah.
and you feel shame because if you go to your parents or if you go to people that are part of the church,
Yeah.
they're not going to really help you that much. And in a sense, you're not going to ask anybody anyway
Yeah.
in the church, within the church. So how do you get over that shame and unlove for yourself because of something that happened in the church?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of research nowadays talks about how shame functions in our body very similar to the way that trauma does. And so when we are, in this case, going to a church and asking for help or just wanting to show up as ourselves and be loved and be accepted, and we're told no, that can't happen or something needs to change, it definitely can kind of trigger those old wounds of abandonment or abuse or neglect, especially if you experienced childhood trauma, right? And so the shame that we feel can oftentimes do the same things to us as that trauma can. It can put our defenses up. It can put us into places of fight, flight, freeze, or collapse. It can put us in a place of wanting to isolate because it feels too scary to be in relationship with one another. I wish I could give everybody like an easy 10-point plan of like, here is what you do, right? But everybody's going to be a little bit different. And I think the first thing that we can do is lean into self-compassion. Not everybody has resources for a good therapist or coach or even to get books or things like that. And so one of the things that we can start to lean into is self-compassion and considering, hey, like what if, I always ask my clients this, what if you didn't do what they said you did? What if you didn't do something wrong? What if you are okay? What if you are lovable? And I know it's not just as easy as telling yourself positive thoughts, but it's this invitation towards, can I see myself as a human being who is suffering at the moment? That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me, but it might mean that I've experienced something really, really difficult. And at the very least, I'm not going to be fighting against myself, like shaming myself, because that can be very, very difficult when we're shaming ourselves and feeling shame from other people. I would always recommend, if it's possible, to be able to reach out for support, maybe in a non-religious institution, whether that's a therapist, a coach, books, podcasts, support groups, things like that. But that can also feel very dangerous when we're hurt in the context of relationship. The idea of reaching out for relationship can be very distressing. And so I always invite people into a slow pace to figure out what feels best for me. How do I titrate or slowly step myself into relationships with others, whether that's a support group or a friendship or a mentorship or a therapist relationship? Can I do that in a way that slowly starts to build trust, so that I'm not having to be re-traumatized or reharmed in the context of relationship?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so many times you go and you hear that, like churches love, and then you go there and you don't get that experience. But so many times also you want to get help,
Mhm.
but you can't, you don't know where to get it. So then the next thing, is like you go around and you're in this church and you want to have a system that you feel good and you grow your heart, because the one thing that the church teaches you, God goes for your heart.
Mhm.
And then you see like the ministers that the lady called and didn't have compassion for her for the
Yeah.
formula. Why do you think that? Because it's always been so much that God believes in your heart, that you find so many pastors and church staff that has a hard heart.
Yeah, I could get on a whole soapbox about this. Um, I think there's a variety of reasons. And again, I want to be careful to say I'm not talking about all pastors and I'm not talking about all churches, but I do think that sometimes specific churches can be very much the breeding ground for dynamics of power and control, including a hierarchy of power based off of a variety of things, whether that's your role in the church, your gender, your socioeconomic status, all sorts of things. Um, and I think that it's important to recognize that this is an institution. And I like to invite people to separate the institution from God. Now, in an ideal world, would we be able to say, I can go to this church and we can worship a higher power that is all about my heart, and so are all of these other people? Yes, that would be the ideal. But I think what we have to grapple with is that sometimes, even in the best meaning systems, again, they're all about making sure that they survive. And so then it promotes people from within, it promotes programs and kind of an entire environment and attitude that fuels that forward. And they forget that, like, oh, if God is all about love, are we matching that? Right. And so I like to invite people to consider, like, leaving a church does not require that you have to give up your relationship with a higher power. You can still have that. It's not always easy, but to uncouple church and God, they don't need to necessarily be like this. You might still be able to have a relationship with God, even if you're not connected to a church. And so if you're finding places that are really promoting this institution or the message or the doctrine over the person, that might be the invitation to step out and to say, who do I know my higher power to be? What matters there? And can I continue to live in accordance with that value system versus what this institution is telling me to? Yeah.
Well, you know, we all learn, right, from our experiences. And we go to church when we're young and they teach us how to do this and they teach us how to do this. And then all of a sudden you become an adult and you kind of have your own values and your own life going on. And you find that you're not accepted,
Mhm.
with this particular church or any, and I'm not trying to, again, I'm like you, I believe there are a lot of good churches, but then so many times I just feel, especially with, who've experienced childhood trauma, that we go to a church that has a lot of people, but we still find ourselves alone because we don't want to say something that's wrong, even though so we put our mask on that we do in the world when we want to come to the church and tell them this is me without a mask. How do you help people take their mask off
Mm.
when they're trying to conform to a church's systems?
Well, I might ask why they might feel the need to wear the mask in the first place. So if you are in any relationship or any system or any institution where your connection, your acceptance, your community is dependent on you wearing a mask and not showing up as who you truly are, I might question the institution more than I would question the person. And I would say, hey, is it possible that we need to find somewhere where we can take the mask down, where we don't have to show up in a specific way in order to be accepted? Now, I know when we're talking about childhood trauma, we sometimes put that mask up as a way to protect ourselves at first, to make sure that something isn't going to happen, if we take that mask down. And so I used the word a little bit earlier called titration. And really what titration is just like little tiny doses. And I think when we're talking about complex trauma, we're talking about a lot of relational wounding. And so the idea of putting ourselves back in a place where there is the potential for really wonderful relationships, but also the potential for more harm from relationships, that can feel very, very scary. So I would encourage anybody to engage in this titration, just little tiny doses of showing up as yourself, maybe in a specific moment or a specific way to say, here's who I am. And I'm going to just show this much, and I'm going to see how do people respond to that, right? Are they responding with kindness and openness and care and connection? Or are they responding with resistance? Are they responding with doubt, question, confusion, shame, things like that? And if I'm only showing this much and their response is no, 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 you can't do that. That might be an indicator to me that, yeah, in order to be accepted, I have to wear the mask. And is that how I want to be then? Do I want to show up in a place only where I can be accepted with this mask on? Or do I maybe want to kind of take myself somewhere else and see if I might be accepted somewhere, somewhere without that mask as I slowly start to take it down? I think it's very normal for anybody who has endured childhood trauma to both crave and desire relationship and be terrified of it at the same time. And so we have to look for ways to safely connect with other people. And oftentimes that takes time and patience and slow moments of trust that is built up over time by slowly revealing ourselves. But that also then gives us time to see, as I reveal myself, how is that going to be responded to? And that gives me a clue of like, can I take another little tiny step in towards connection? Or maybe I take a step out.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it, Dr. Laura, comes to it in our society, right? We're taught to do systems. We go to school and we learn to obey and just do what we tell you. We go to, a church and they say, well, this is the way that we function. And if you want to step outside of that, because now today there's so much social media and there's so much opportunity for people to step outside of the system and really become the person that they kind of dream about.
Mm.
But then you get into a place that's bound and determined to keep the system and the function the way it is. How do you help people kind of get out of that situation?
Yeah. Well, I want to just make note that oftentimes when we're in those systems, it can be very difficult to get out because those systems often will have teachings either overtly or covertly that suggest if you have a problem with a system, there's actually a problem with you. It's not the system's problem, it's your problem. And that can create, as you can imagine, a lot of shame and a lot of self-doubt and self-hatred and confusion for why am I questioning the system? I just need to conform more. So, one of the first steps, if we want to call it that, is really like giving some voice to your questions and doubts and allowing yourself to say, hey, well, what if that is valid? What if my questions here are valid? What if my disagreement with this isn't about, my doubt or, rage or anything like that. Maybe it's a valid question to what is actually happening here. And I think whenever I work with people that are coming out of these systems, it almost always starts with a curiosity. Where they're going, this isn't quite sitting right with me, this teaching or the way they reacted here, things like that. And can I kind of pull at that thread of curiosity of what is happening, right? It almost always starts on a cognitive level where we start to kind of cognitively deconstruct things and we go, I don't know if I really agree with this or believe that, or isn't quite adding up. And some people get to that question part and they go, that's too much. If I pull that thread, I might lose everything. And so they kind of put themselves back into the system. But more and more now, people are asking questions and they're going, I think I might keep asking a question and another question and another question. My invitation to people is always like, can you let yourself continue to do that? Can you let yourself continue to ask questions? Can you allow yourself to hear different opinions and voices or read different things or listen to different podcasts or whatnot to give yourself some additional perspectives and to say, wow, maybe there's other things going on here. And in my experience, that's usually the most common way that people are leaving systems like this. Another common way is that perhaps they've done something that the system doesn't agree with, and then they are excommunicated or they are shunned or they are disfellowshipped. That is common too, or where they're kind of strongly advised to leave, you're not welcome here. And I think usually what happens then is there's a lot of shock and grief that comes with that of, have I done something wrong? Should I just have conformed or listened or gone along with what they wanted? And that is a very valid response to this too, because in a lot of cases, people have their entire identity, relationships, everything about their life is wrapped up into this church. And all of a sudden, they're kind of kicked out into the cold and they have none of that anymore. And so I think that's another common response. And I always encourage people to validate that, even if they consciously know this was not a great place for me to be, or this was a place where I had to conform. It is okay to miss that. It is okay to grieve the community that you had, the relationships, the identity. Like that was who you were. Grief means that it mattered to you, that this was important to you. And so I think those are kind of two things that tend to come up first with the clients that I work with is that cognitive deconstruction piece, as well as then just really leaning into the grief, the sadness, the emptiness that can be felt after such a huge loss like that.
I mean, so many times it can be something so simple, like I went to, you got your grandparents or your parents went to church. You go to your church all the time, and then you get a job that serves liquor,
Yes.
and all of a sudden your parents say, no, you can't have that job because it serves liquor, but you're not going to drink.
Sure.
And so there's just so many things, I guess, that sometimes you can be doing the right thing, but
Mhm.
it's looked as the wrong thing by the church and by the people who that you've been
Mhm.
growing up with.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about how we can just overcome little things like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, one of the things I talk about a lot is what I call dynamics of power and control inside of religion. And I think people are actually more familiar with this than they might know. We see this a lot in dynamics of power and control inside of domestically violent relationships and understanding how abuse happens. And almost always, abuse does not, when you think of somebody being physically assaulted, somebody doesn't just wake up one day and decide, I'm going to hit my partner, right? Or I'm going to let my partner hit me. It's a series of very small choices and experiences that happen that get you to a place of saying, yeah, when my partner hits me, maybe it is my fault, right? Like maybe I did something to cause that. But if they were to just one day, if they were, just the most wonderful person and then they wake up one day and they hit you, that would be very shocking. And you would know, like, no, 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 this is not okay. And so when we see dynamics of power and control, it happens slowly over time. Little choices are taken away. Your voice, your autonomy, your own sense of power, they're kind of stripped away little by little. The same is true in high control religious environments. If you walked into a church and they said, the moment you walk into this church, you owe us this percentage of your income and you must dress like this and you must not associate with these people and you have to get this job and not do that job and you can't listen to these things. somebody would be like, absolutely not. I am not walking through those doors, right? But that's not usually what happens. It's a slow thing over time where they say, you know what? You probably shouldn't be wearing that. That's not really something that jives with our faith. Or are you sure that you should be working at that job with alcohol? I know you're not drinking it, but that doesn't really look so good. And it's really easy to justify those little things because it's like, well, yeah, you're right. And maybe I shouldn't be wearing this, or maybe I shouldn't be going to this place. Maybe I should reevaluate my friends, right? It in some ways makes logical sense. But what's happening is slowly your autonomy is being eroded, your individuality, your sense of choice and power, empowerment, that's being eroded and replaced with what the church system wants and how they want you to act and react. And so until one day you do start to realize, wow, everything I do and the way I talk and who I spend my time with, it's all connected to the church or it's connected to what they want for me instead of who I am. And so I think it's important to recognize that that's what is happening when we start to notice it's these little things that are happening. They might seem very little at the time, but you also might notice that over time, all of a sudden I'm not myself anymore. I'm not able to, do what I want, or I'm not able to speak how I want, or I'm always afraid of being punished for not conforming. And it happens very, very slowly until all of a sudden one day you're like, oh yeah, I am in this. And they have control over me. And as a result, I'm also liable for the consequences of what would happen if I didn't do what they said.
Right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the tithe with you.
Yes. Ha,
Uh,
yes.
because that's the big thing in the church, right? Is to give your 10%, to give your 10%. And so many people, especially in today's economy and society, where money is just tight. And
Yeah.
and have faith that your car won't get repossessed if you give us the money today, right?
Right.
How do you because we do become kind of obsessed a little bit with the tithe, right? I mean, I have to give my 10%, I have to give my 10%. But then there's so many people that haven't really got the faith yet to take that 10%, but then they leave the church feeling a little bit bad because they gave what they thought they could afford. How do people kind of address that in their minds?
Yeah, I mean, part of that I would say, um, yeah, if there's a system that is requiring an amount of money from you in order to be accepted, like we should question that, right? There should be some sort of an exchange. So I'm a therapist. Clients pay me, but what they get in return is a service from me. They get my wisdom, my knowledge, my presence, like the interventions, like all these things, right? There's an exchange for that money. We've entered into an agreement that this is what I'm providing for you. You may quit at any time, right? And I will not charge you or continue to charge you, for you quitting, right? And so it's an equitable exchange, right? That's certainly not suggesting that you can't give money to anybody who you would want or that everybody who's asking for donations is somehow corrupt. That is not what I'm saying at all. But when we say in order for you to be a part of our group, um, and that equals your love and acceptance, and in order to do so, you must give a certain amount of money. And not only must you give that, that is in direct correlation with your salvation, with where you're going to end up after you die, with how holy you are, if you're a true believer, all of these things. I think those are things we should start to question. Why must we tie somebody's eternal destiny to how much money I decide to give this building in this community, right? I think it's a fair thing to ask those questions. And I think it's okay for somebody to say like, yeah, I can't do that. I've got children's mouths that I've got to put food in or I've got to keep the lights on, right? And I would even question why is this building, this institution more important than these literal, lives, these children, this house, the well-being of individuals? Again, then we're valuing the institution over the actual human. I think it's important to start asking those questions. Why would somebody say it's okay for my children to go without food so long as they get this 10%? We need to ask questions about that. Why is that? I wish I had a more simple answer of like, yeah, just, just tell them, whatever, I don't need to pay you anything. But it doesn't feel like we have that choice in these high control religions. And so I'm all about when we're looking at dynamics of power and control, whether that is in a relationship with an individual or in a religious institution, your voice and your choice is taken away. And so my job then as the therapist is to start to invite you to consider, what do you really want? What's really going on? What do you really think? Right? Maybe it doesn't mean that you act right away because it might feel like too much to try to do something different. But I always want to invite that person to say, well, what if you just let yourself kind of mull over on that question a little bit? What if you just gave yourself permission to think about something different or consider a different option, right? And that starts to get those wheels turning of going, what do I want? Is this really what I want to be doing? So I think that starts to develop their own voice and their own choice again that has been taken away from them prior.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that churches tend to do, and it's part of their religion is, and you mentioned it a couple of times, the control is that they end up teaching you that if you don't do this, you go to hell, right?
Yes.
And no, and the only time Jesus ever got upset was when the religious people were trying to take stuff from the regular people.
Yeah.
So how do we get rid of the fear that's taught in the church and I think it's been for centuries, not just these days, but we're taught about love, but then if you do all of this, you're going to burn in hell. How do
Mhm.
we just overcome that?
Oh man, that is a long process, right? There's a variety of different clinical tools that I work with clients to kind of navigate that fear because that is a very real thing, right? And that I think one of the ways we can conceptualize it is that fear allows people to be controlled. So if somebody is fearful of something happening, they are open to solutions and ideas that might alleviate some of that fear, right? And so if they go, I'm terrified that I'm going to end up in eternal conscious torment, and here's this preacher who is selling me this bill of goods that includes eternal life, that feels very appealing. And I'm going to be inclined to continue to listen to that person and to do what they are saying because I want to mitigate my fear. And they're telling me what I can do to make sure that this terrifying outcome doesn't happen. And so I think that it's important to recognize that is that fear, when somebody is fearful, they are easier to control. And I don't mean that in a shaming way, like, oh, you brought this on yourself. I mean that in an exploitative way. People are exploiting other people's natural human fears and vulnerabilities, and they're using that as a way to control and towards their own outcome. So how do we get over that? Oh my gosh. I mean, that's a whole other talk unto itself. I think sometimes recognizing the dynamic is the first kind of step of saying like, I want to be accurate and honest about what is actually happening here and give myself permission to see like, oh, my vulnerabilities, my fear has actually been preyed upon for somebody else's, good or their pocketbook or, things like that. But then I think also getting curious about that fear. I really like internal family systems, which uses the language of parts. And I like to say, okay, we have this part of us that feels really, really scared right now because of all of this messaging or because of the things that have happened. And if we get to know that part a little bit and see what is that part actually scared of, that might give us some clues into what do we actually need in order to find safety. So often that safety actually just needs to be found within ourselves. Religion is really good at externalizing everything. You find your safety, your goodness, your worth, and your value outside of yourself. Part of healing from trauma, and I would say the foundation of healing from trauma, is learning to find those resources, that safety, that stability, that security inside of yourself. That doesn't mean that you'll never feel afraid or that fear will be gone forever, but that means when that fear pops back up, that little fear part pops back up, you have resources and tools within you to be able to deal with that, not having to look for the external people to tell you what to do in order to alleviate that fear.
Well, I'm going to do a little bit of curiosity here for you. As I see the church as the questions that I'm asking you. what are questions that maybe I haven't asked you, but some of the more popular questions that you get asked about church trauma that are some of our audience might know that's going through, but I'm just not asking.
Sure. Well, I will say that the most common question that I get is, what is religious trauma? Which, it seems like, oh, maybe, yeah, that's a great question. And it sounds maybe cliche, but what I say is religious trauma is trauma. And so this is a conference on childhood trauma. And so there's probably been conversations about like, how does trauma live in your body and what happens in the nervous system, or the physiological components. And I would say religious trauma fits right into that. I said earlier, I think that religious trauma falls under the umbrella of complex trauma, the same way that, childhood or developmental trauma does. And so when we look at it through that lens, instead of childhood events being kind of the precursor for this trauma, we're looking at religious institutions, teachings, relationships, experiences, spiritual abuse, things like that, that are the kind of the foundation of where that trauma is resulting from. And so I really feel like it's important to recognize religious trauma as trauma, because it then allows us access to tools and research and modalities of therapy and knowledge that is already tried and true, to be able to say, hey, this is how we can help people who are navigating religious trauma or who have experienced religious trauma. So I think that's one thing that I always like to just kind of have as a foundational piece, is that, whether you're a practitioner or a coach or just somebody who is, coming out of a high control religion or wanting to support those that are, using your trauma knowledge is very, very helpful. And you don't have to go get a degree in religious trauma, especially because there are no degrees in religious trauma. But just recognizing that religious trauma is trauma. And so the way that we understand trauma in the body and the nervous system as a result of anything else is the same way that we can understand religious trauma as well.
Well, we're going to wrap it up here. What is the one little bit word of wisdom that you would like to give to our viewers if they experienced it, or if they're just trying to think whether they want to change churches or just accept it? What's that one little word of wisdom you can give?
The first thing that popped into my head is, you can trust yourself. I think it's so important to be able to do that. I think in a lot of high control religions, again, that trust is externalized. You can't trust yourself, or you have to trust these doctrines, theologies, pastors, other people. And that divorces you from yourself. And so I always love to invite people to go like, hey, if this is stirring something inside you, if this is causing you to ask questions, if you're not quite sure, trust that. Trust that. It doesn't mean you have to make a change right away, but it is inviting you to consider that maybe what you're feeling, you can trust. And if you did that, if you did trust yourself, then what, right? And continue to trust yourself. So that is my biggest encouragement. You can trust yourself.
No, well, that's a little bit, that's good that we can trust ourselves.
Yes.
But, Dr. Laura, thank you so, so much for being a part of the summit and sharing your wisdom on what I think is becoming a growing consequence for some of us, especially who have already experienced trauma. Now we're just trying to fit into a place, and we find that we're not fitting in again.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to get in contact with you so you can help them, how can they do that? And we'll put it on the screen here once you say it.
Yeah. Well, my website is drlauraeanderson.com, and that's where you can connect with me if you're wanting to work with me, find my book, my social media. I also have a company, trauma coaching company, where we focus on working with people coming out of high control religions. It is called the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, and that is traumaresolutionandrecovery.com. We have coaches all over the United States who work with clients all over the world navigating this, and we do free inquiry calls. So you can always select a coach and start working with somebody who's a good fit for you.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, and we'll be talking soon. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you.